Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the Goosebumps Series 2000 series, and it's book number 2, Bride of the Living Dummy. Now, me and this book go way back. This was one of the earliest Goosebumps books I can remember reading. It wasn't in the first 5 I read, but it was definitely in the first 10. And this was one of the handful of books I actually owned in my collection as a child. So I read this book many times. And I also own the episode on VHS, and I watched that episode all the time. And it made Bride of the Living Dummy one of my childhood favorite stories. If you ask me, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, Bride of the Living Dummy would have been in my top 5 Goosebumps books, and the episode would have been in my top 5 episodes. Now, over the years, my love has really dwindled for Bride of the Living Dummy. And when referring to the book, I don't know, it's one of those stories that just have left me. And after rereading it as an adult, the last time I read this book before this time for this review, I was maybe 13 years old, back when Cartoon Network got the show reruns, and I was interested in reading the series again. So of course I went back and read the book, and the last time I left off on it, I had changed my mind and thought that the book was nowhere near as good as I thought it was when I was younger. And I still maintain that idea this time, but I do dare say that this is still a solid Goosebumps book for what it is. Now, is it the greatest thing ever? No. But does it get a recommend from me? Sure. If you haven't read Bride of the Living Dummy, you should really go try this book. I highly recommend it. In some regards, I think there's something in here that will be something for somebody. I'm not saying the whole book outright, but at least something in here. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So the story starts out, and you get to meet this girl named Jillian. And Jillian is this 12-year-old girl. She, is pestered by her twin siblings who are younger than her, Katie and Amanda. And Katie and Amanda have this doll named Mary Ellen. And Mary Ellen is this really creepy doll, almost the size of them. And the two girls are pretty much inseparable from this Mary Ellen doll. And they constantly refer to her and ask her questions, ask her permission to do things, take her everywhere that they go. And it drives Jillian nuts, which understandably it would. And Jillian just thinks that her siblings are annoying. And the doll, she wishes that she can just destroy and have the whole family forget about it. Well, one night, she is sleeping and she is awakened by a blade being put at her throat. Yeah, this is a Series 2000, so it's trying to insert some shock value there. And she realizes that it's her sisters trying to give her a haircut because Mary Ellen told them to. And the sister is really upset with them and says, Mary Ellen can't be telling you to do this. You guys are crazy. And I hate that doll. And please leave me alone. Well, because of that, Jillian's not in the right headspace with Katie and Amanda going into the next day. And it's revealed by Jillian that her father has been too busy working on stuff in his workshop down in the basement, so he's pretty much taken out of the parenting role. So the mom is pretty much primarily parenting them, and the mom reminds Jillian that today is an event that she promised to take Katie and Amanda to, and it ends up being this ventriloquist event at this theater nearby them. And Jillian really doesn't want to go. And her friend Harrison, who's her best friend, he's a 12-year-old kid. He's a bigger guy, kind of muscular, seems like he has a big appetite, kind of sporty. Comes by to visit and wants to hang out, and realizes that Jillian has to go on this, excursion with her siblings. And, of course, Katie and Amanda are excited to go, and Harrison's like, oh, I don't know if I want to go. And Jillian's like, please come with me. I don't want to be stuck with them too. And the girls want to bring Mary Ellen, and Jillian tries to put her foot down, but the mom gets into it, and the girls pretty much get their way. And Jillian's like, well, fine, I guess they can bring Mary Ellen. So they head to the theater to see this ventriloquist called Jimmy O. James. And Jimmy O. James is headlining this show with this dummy called Slappy. Now, to us readers, this is I guess the fourth dummy book in the release order of these dummy books at the time. We all know that Slappy's evil, right? So Jimmy O. James, this ventriloquist guy, has somehow gotten in possession of Slappy and is preparing to do a show. And they get ready, they sit down in their seats. Katie and Amanda plop down Mary Ellen. Jillian sits down with Harrison, and they watch the act of Jimmy O. James. And he's lighting up the crowd, making funny jokes with Slappy. There's some funny quips there. And then there's a part of the show where essentially the kids are invited to come up and, interact with Slappy. And, of course, the twins and Mary Ellen decide to go up and see Slappy. And there's some off-cuff remarks made by Jimmy O. James. And he seems like he's not telling Slappy to do this stuff, right? And Slappy seems to be kind of having a life of his own and makes some of the kids cry, and the show ends abruptly, right? And in the aftermath, Jillian is looking for her sisters, and she decides to split up with Harrison, and she makes her way to explore the theater, and she overhears a conversation between Jimmy O. James and a dummy that sounds like Slappy. And she interrupts Jimmy O. James, and Jimmy is essentially like trying to hide the fact that Slappy was pretty much just alive, and Jillian kind of questions him about it, and he tries to deter the situation, and she's like, well, have you seen my siblings? And he's like, no, I'm sorry, I haven't. And she's like, well, thanks anyway, and she kind of files that in the back of her brain. Well, she ends up finding her siblings with Mary Ellen, and everything seems alright, but she can't find Harrison, so she figures that she'll catch up with Harrison later. So they end up back to their home, and they see Slappy the dummy sitting on their couch. And this scares Jillian at first, and she's like, well, I just saw Slappy come to life. What is up with this? And it's revealed that Harrison was somehow commanding Slappy, and Jillian's like, well, how did you get Slappy? What happened here? And he's like, well, it's a funny story. I couldn't find you, so I hung out with some friends, and I was killing some time. And I figured that it was getting late, so I should probably leave and catch up with you later. Well, I was wandering around, and in a trash can, I found Slappy chilling in a trash can. And I decided to take him. It seems like Jimmy O. James threw him away. And Jillian's like, I don't think he would throw him away like that. And he's like, no, he was in the trash. So if he doesn't want him, I'll keep him. And Jillian observes Slappy and finds a card in his jacket, typical of these dummy books, and starts to read the spell a little bit, gets about midway, and then she's interrupted when Slappy bites her hand. And it's attributed to being like a malfunction of the dummy. And she's like, that really hurt. And Harrison's like, well, since it's broken, can your dad fix the dummy for me? And Jillian's like, well, he's kind of busy doing stuff right now in his workshop, but I'll see what I can do. So she promises Harrison that'll be a thing. Well, later that night, Jillian gets this idea because once Slappy comes home, the sisters start really annoying her with Mary Ellen at dinner. And Jillian decides that, Mary Ellen is annoying and her sisters are annoying, and she wants a little bit of revenge on them for all this stuff that's been happening to her. So she decides to get a little bit even and tries to come up with this prank to tie their shoes and stuff. But before she can do that, she gets spooked by hearing something downstairs, and she files that in her brain like, oh, it must be Slappy. Well, she heads back up to her room and finds Slappy waiting there. And, of course, Slappy is revealed to be puppeteered by the sisters. And Jillian's like, very funny. You guys are, class act. Enough of this. And the girls are like, just admit that you're scared that Slappy came to life. And she's like, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. And It carries over to the next day when, Jillian, she's just getting progressively more upset with her siblings. And she reminds Harrison that they have a birthday party to work the coming up weekend, and they're supposed to be clowns, and they need to go to the magic shop to get some supplies. And Harrison's like, okay, remind me why we're doing this. And she's like, well, we're going to get paid, and we're going to split the profit. So Harrison and her go to this local magic shop, and they pick up some fun little tricks for the birthday party. And they bid farewell, and Jillian heads back home, but she's surprised when she heads into her room, and there's a pet lizard she has that plays into the beginning of the story as well, named Petey. And Petey's cage has been opened, and Slappy has been situated over the cage, insinuating that he's trying to do something to Petey, but Petey goes missing. And this freaks Jillian out. She goes and confronts her siblings, and they say that they didn't do anything. And of course, her parents come home, and she tells the parents that Petey went missing. And they immediately think to blame the little girls because they were the only kids that could have done it. And it obviously can't be Slappy. Slappy can't be alive, right? Well, they eventually find Petey, and he's alright, but he came out of Slappy's mouth, implying that Slappy or somebody put the lizard down Slappy's throat. And the girls get reprimanded for this, and Jillian's kind of worked up over what happened. Well, it comes to a point where they have to do this birthday party at that weekend, and Harrison and Jillian have been practicing their skits. They got it all lined up, and they go to this birthday party, but everything seems to go south for them. The tricks and stuff they have planned backfired because they thought that one person prepared it over the other and vice versa. And it comes to a point to where they have this trick involving a pie that's supposed to be made of whipped cream, but somebody changed it with whipped cream, not whipped cream, but with shaving cream. And the kids got it in their eyes and started burning their eyes. And the two of them got kicked out of the birthday party. So they head home, and Jillian's really upset, wondering who could have, ruined their act. And it comes to a point of the story where it pretty much kicks on the final act, where Harrison and Jillian know that they have another birthday party the following weekend, and Harrison's like, well, why don't we try to use Slappy to be a dummy? Maybe we can try ventriloquism, right? And she's like, well, I don't know, and Harrison's like, well, look, let's go try to find Jimmy O. James. I heard he lives over here, this part of town. So they decide to go over there and explore maybe where Jimmy O. James lives, and they have to go through a bad part of town, and they end up at this house. And while in the house, they uncover some dummy parts lying around. It looks disheveled. The weeds and the grass is overgrown in the front lawn. But they find Jimmy O. James's journal, and he's writing about stuff about Slappy and like some lore things about Slappy for the first time in this franchise. And he apparently has a lot of backstory and knowledge about where Slappy came from and the origins and how he was built and all of that. And then he reveals in his latest entry, which was the day before, and I didn't mention this, but Jillian thought she saw Jimmy O. James coming out of the magic store when they went there earlier and tried to flag him down, but he ran away. But even prior to that, this was right up to when, before Harrison found Slappy in the trash can, that Jimmy O. James thought he managed to turn Slappy off. And that his evil is pretty much empowered by this ancient sorcerer that built him out of coffin wood. And that seems to be a trend that has played a part in future Slappy books after this. And Jillian seems to be spooked and starts to believe that this is all real. And Harrison's like, are you really going to believe this stuff out of the journal? And Jillian's like, yeah. So I really don't want to use Slappy as a dummy. And Harrison's like, well, our clown's act sucks. We got to use something. So they come up with an idea to potentially use Mary Ellen. She's a creepy doll, and they can use her for the birthday party. So Jillian comes back home, and there's this whole situation that happens where she finds Slappy sitting on her dresser next to her mirror saying, like, where's my bride, or I want my bride, or something like that. And she immediately thinks that it was the twins. And she goes to the twins and says, "Did you do this to my room?" And they say no. And Jillian's like, "Well, I'm starting to kind of believe them. Something's wrong with Slappy here." And the girls, meanwhile, got punished and had Mary Ellen taken away from them from the previous stunt they tried to pull, supposedly, with the lizard. And they were forced to put Mary Ellen in the top of their closet. Well, after confronting her siblings, Jillian's like, "Well, I think something's wrong with Slappy. I have this bad vibe. I really want to get rid of him." So she tries to hide Slappy. Well, comes to the point of the day of the next birthday party. And somehow Harrison found another dummy for him to use from his uncle. And Jillian's going to bring Mary Ellen. So Jillian brings Mary Ellen, and Harrison brings the chest with the other dummy in it. But he opens it up, and surprise, it's Slappy inside. And the kids are getting kind of restless. They have to host the birthday party at Jillian's house because the kid who's going to have the birthday party had their house flooded. And Jillian realizes she's pressed for time and has to overcome her fear that she's built up with Slappy the whole book to put on the show for the kids. Well, this is where the climax of the story happens. So Mary Ellen and Slappy are having some banter. Some kids are laughing. The birthday party kid's not laughing too much. And then Slappy gets kind of unhinged and does this thing that we haven't seen since the first book with Mr. Wood, where essentially there's projectile green vomit everywhere. And gets all over the kids and causes a pandemonium down in the basement. And as the kids start scattering, everybody just looks in bewilderment about Slappy potentially being alive. And that's including Katie and Amanda, who are off in the corner. And they're just in bewilderment. And Slappy's like, "Enough of this birthday party. I want to have a wedding party. I want my bride." And Jillian has her, like, having her, is getting attacked by Slappy. Tells Harrison to say, "Okay, just bring over Mary Ellen. He must be talking about Mary Ellen." And Slappy's like, "No, I don't want Mary Ellen. I want you, Jillian." And this is where the story gets really bizarre. So Slappy is alive and wants to have a wedding party and marry Jillian, a 12-year-old girl. And there's some things that Slappy does. And Slappy, in this part of the story, he seems very violent. He's like punching things, headbutting things. He gives Jillian what is called a love tap. Need I say anything else? And Jillian's freaked out. And Slappy gets distracted at one point by a big old plot twist. And it turns out that Mary Ellen may or may not be alive. And the twins come over to Jillian and drop a bombshell about Mary Ellen, about all the actions that took place previously in the story up to that point. And it gets recontextualized that all this may or may not be attributed to Mary Ellen. And Mary Ellen has her own motives to why she's been doing this to Jillian, potentially. And when you hear the motives, you're like, okay, that makes some sense. Some things don't really add up, but it makes enough sense, right? And you hear Mary Ellen's intentions with Slappy. Well, those intentions don't match up, and they get into a scuffle. And something may or may not happen to them, because since they're down in the basement, that's where the father's workshop is. There's something that happens to them, let's just say. And the story kind of ends up after that event. There's a time jump, and we learn about the aftermath of everything that happened. And there's something that may or may not be wrong. And I'll just leave it at that. And that's essentially Bride of the Living Dummy. Okay. So let's start off with the positives. First off, I think Jillian, up until this point, is probably my second favorite dummy protagonist that I've read in these books, at least within the first four. She has a really good head on her shoulders. A lot of the decisions she made in the story shows her ingenuity, shows that she has a lot of patience with her sisters. And, there are some bits where she wants to get revenge on them, but it's understandable. She's that older sibling that's tormented by her younger siblings, and this doll they carry around. And all of those emotions that she feels towards them is essentially warranted and verified by the end of it. She's a backable protagonist with a good head on her shoulders and good intuition. Now, a lot of the stuff with her character, she doesn't have the deepest monologue or anything, but we see a lot of her character come out in these situations she's thrown into in the story. She's a person of her word. She wants to do right by people and look good, and she keeps having that taken away from her throughout the story, and that causes her to want revenge more and more and more. And it's also making her confront the whole thing about Slappy throughout the whole book. When she sees that with Jimmy O. James at the show, that carries throughout the whole book, and you see that paranoia with her character, and that really works to build tension between her and Slappy and the unknowns about what's really going on. Her friend Harrison's also a really good character and side character, I think. They have good dynamics and balance off each other. They feel like natural friends, and I really dug that. The sisters are kind of annoying, but by the end, you understand why they've been doing what they're doing, and as loose as it is, it kind of redeems them a little bit for how annoying they were throughout the book. But they're pretty much good red herrings for the story, and utilized very well. The atmosphere to the book, now, I'll say this, the Prowse isn't that well written compared to the rest of the Dummy franchise up to this point, but what I will say is that the atmosphere was really fun and expansive. There's multiple setting changes compared to the previous Dummy books, and I dare say that the setting changes made it at least interesting in some parts. You get to go to parts of the town, you get to go explore an old house, a magic shop. Of course, you have Jillian's home. You get to go to a theater, explore a theater. And Stein really tried to, make the story feel expansive. And that comes down to even the lore and backstory of Slappy, which comes out of nowhere, really. But I think it adds kind of this layer and mysticism to Slappy's character that we haven't seen before at this point. And I think it's a good change up involving that stuff. And yeah, Mary Ellen, may or may not be one of the main villains of the story. And she was awesome. Genuinely awesome. I like that reveal. It made that climax feel a whole lot more fun. And yeah. But my negatives with the story, I mean, these are kind of hard to say because when I was younger, I didn't really see these as negatives, but I do now. One of my biggest negatives is the first 3 or 4 chapters have a lot of fake outs and stuff, and that kind of builds up into the play portion or the ventriloquist show when they go to the theater, and all that's kind of cool, and how Slappy gets acquired and the whole spying on Jimmy O. James stuff is really good. But once Harrison brings Slappy home to Jillian, and Jillian's now supposed to give Slappy over to her dad to fix, the story gets really bland for a good portion of it. And here's what I mean by that. You go from having all this suspense built up with Slappy to now preparing this whole segment of the story for, I guess Stein's idea was to set up this birthday party for them to dress up like clowns to set up the ending, which is another birthday party that is supposed to be the big finale. But all that preparation, the clown stuff, going to the magic shop, seeing Jimmy O. James, but him running away and stuff, and them completely botching the birthday party there, I feel like it's complete filler. Because once you realize, essentially after that birthday party and who was behind it, the characters question it, and when Jillian comes back, I feel like when she comes back and continues on for the rest of the story, that matters more than any of this stuff beforehand with the clown stuff. I mean, it's just straight padding to fill out page space. Like chapters, I think 11 or 12 through chapter 17 is straight padding. It's just unnecessary. And putting that aside, the whole exploring Jimmy O. James's house bit is also kind of tied into that, making it all the way up until like chapter 20, when they have to go try to find Jimmy O. James to learn about ventriloquism. I feel like that part's kind of forced, just to kind of shoehorn in some tension of them trying to track down Jimmy O. James. And when you hear that the kids want to learn ventriloquism from him, I'm starting to kind of question that, because in my opinion, I think Stein should have went the direction that, Jillian just wants to return Slappy. And Harrison might have been against it, but I feel like that birthday party stuff should have been cut out. And they should have went to the Jimmy O. James part immediately after Harrison brought the dummy home. And she should have been like, well, I think Slappy's alive. And they read the card, and Slappy bites her hand. And then she should be like, okay, let's go try to return this to Jimmy. Instead of going through all of this filler stuff. But given that we had the clown stuff beforehand, this part even feels like filler, because the kids don't even think to return Slappy. They're just going to explore, asking him for advice and stuff. And when he's revealed not to be there, all they come out of the situation knowing is some backstory about Slappy that kind of feels forced. It kind of feels like it's forced in there to kind of drill to Jillian that Slappy is something to be fearful of. And while it is adding lore and stuff, and I do appreciate that, it just feels kind of out of place in the story. But aside from that, there's gaps in, of course, Jimmy O. James. And I haven't brought up Jimmy O. James as a character, but there's so many gaps I feel are kind of egregious with this character. Like, how did he get in possession of Slappy? It's never really explained, even in his diary of sorts. How he puts Slappy to sleep? Well, if you've read Slappy's Nightmare after this, a lot of people seem to consider that Slappy's Nightmare is the prequel to this book, which I can kind of see, and it does kind of fit. But still, it makes me question, well, how did Jimmy get him to go to sleep? It also makes me question back to Dummy 1 to Dummy 2, if it indeed is a loose sequel, as people claim it is, then how did Lindy and Chris turn Slappy off? You know what I mean? It's questions like that, and it raises more things than it probably should have with Jimmy. And I just don't feel like I got what I'm looking for out of Jimmy. I think they Stein took a little too much liberty with this character and kind of took it a little too far. It made it a little confusing. And that leads into the final act, of course. And the final act, I think, is easily the best part of the book, but it's also equally disappointing at the same time in some ways. When you hear what's going on in the story, up to this point, we already have seen these plot beats done in the previous 3 Dummy books, and I'm not going to lie. The Dummy 1, Dummy 2, Dummy 3 all have similar plot beats, and this is no different, but it's more like splicing them together with its own little twist near the end. But what's frustrating is the stuff that they do with Slappy here. They give him attributes that are more associated with Mr. Wood. And I feel like Slappy is actually just becoming Mr. Wood in this book than Slappy. He doesn't really feel like Slappy. And that kind of comes down to Slappy's motives. This might be kind of a touchy thing, but Slappy wanting to marry Jillian, a 12-year-old girl, and wanting her to be his bride, it's a little bit out there. Now, is it as icky as people sometimes make it out to be? Not really. It's the only thing that's kind of out there is the whole love tap thing, and yeah. But Slappy's like really violent and like punching Mary Ellen and punching Jillian, biting her hand, and it makes me think back to some parts of the story when Slappy's like biting down on her hand and implying that Slappy's a broken dummy. If Jimmy really put him to sleep, then how is he doing some of this stuff? Even with the revelation about Mary Ellen potentially being involved, some of that stuff just, I don't know, doesn't really come off all that believable. And, I don't know. That part with Slappy's motive kind of recontextualizes the book in some ways. Kind of makes you think back to what was really going on, and it's just it is kind of weird. But leading into the Mary Ellen bits, that also kind of fuels that confusing bits about Slappy throughout the story. Slappy being heavily implied that he's already alive, but when you learn that he was essentially turned off by Jimmy in Jimmy's diary, where you're like, okay, well, how did he turn back on? Well, there's a part of the story where Jillian suspects that it must have been her sisters that accidentally turned him on. But when you hear Mary Ellen's motives and how long Slappy has been alive, it makes it feel like Slappy just took a backseat in his own book. And while I think that's good for Mary Ellen's character as a one-and-done character, but for Slappy, it makes him look really weak. And given that what we actually got from his character, he's just becoming a Mr. Wood knockoff. And in my opinion, I think this is some of the weakest Slappy I've seen in these books. It doesn't feel like Slappy, if I'm being honest. And that feeds into the final twist of it all. And the final twist is fine. I don't really have too much objections with it. I just don't like the implications it has for the story. I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't even want to spoil it. It has to do with one of the characters, and I don't like the implications of that. And I'm just being honest. But yeah, those things kind of add up. These are like smaller-ish issues I have that just kind of pile on, like 0.2, 0.3 issues. So from like a 0 to 5 star basis, I knew I was going to give this book at least a 3.5 or higher. I couldn't bring myself to give this book a 4 or higher, only because I think this book has more problems, kind of synonymous with C-tier books. It follows the formula a little too close in some areas for me. It kind of falls flat in some areas where the story really comes to shine. It has some filler to it, and some questionable character choices, and probably my least favorite Slappy. So, you know, it's a C-tier book, and I would go out of my way to say it's good for at least Jillian and Harrison and some of the characters, and Mary Ellen being like a really cool villain by the end. And, you know, some really good tense scenes built up there by the end were also really good. I think it's a more average book, so from like a 0 to 5 star basis, I'd probably give this like a 3.7 out of 5. You know, I could give it a little bit higher, but I think a 3.7 is perfectly fair for this. It's right in the middle of a C. It's average as can be, but it's also a light good. I'd recommend this to people, and trust me, I'm not underselling this book. It's just that it's not the greatest thing ever. You know what I mean? I think there's been better dummy books before it and after it. So yeah, kind of disappointing for one of my childhood favorite books. But that's my thoughts on Bride of the Living Dummy. Let me know down in the comment section. Do you love this book? Do you hate this book? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.